just generally, it's pretty rough to start off with. So
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So, welcome to Judaism, Jewish Community and Race, a course from Pluralistic Rabbinical Seminary. This masterclass is made possible by TribeHerald Media, and we certainly appreciate their help. So, our guest is Abbie Yamamoto, diversity trainer and coach, cross-cultural and marketing consultant, and I believe owner as well of One Transliteracy LLC and contributor to TribeHerald. So, Abbie, welcome to PRS.
hi, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
So, a quick amount of sort of housekeeping here. My understanding is that you spent some time at UC Berkeley. Is that right?
I did. Well, I didn't spend a lot of time there, considering that I completed my PhD there. My PhD took 10 years. I did it straight from my college, but I only spent 3 years on campus.
Gotcha.
So, and I spent some time actually in UCLA and New York and Tokyo and Seoul.
Well, my wife went to UC Berkeley, so I mean, we can just go on ahead and verify the glory that is UC Berkeley just off of that. So I'd like to begin by reading a quote from your piece, The Gift of Growing Up Jewish in Japan, recently published on TribeHerald. So, going to a college full of Jews from the most established Jewish community outside Israel taught me a lot. It showed me that while I grew up totally confident in my Jewish self, that many saw me as an outsider. Many Jews also seemed to think that being Jewish was an insurmountable hurdle if they were not part of a large established community. I've seen this attitude especially among American Jews who grew up not in or around one of these well-established communities in New York, Los Angeles, or Chicago. I think they are letting Jews from the more established communities define what it means to be Jewish in Maine, Indiana, or North Dakota, but it doesn't have to be that way. So, could you please, Abbie, give us some background on who you are and what inspired you to write that line and the piece just in general, The Gift of Growing Up Jewish in Japan?
Yeah, so I love that that's the sentence or that's the part that you pick up because it's kind of the thing that I find I keep talking about now is about sort of. So I grew up I was born and raised in Japan until 17, and I left home for schooling in this. My education is sort of this whole thing, so I don't want to get into it. But I went to Canada for 2 years, and then went to Barnard College, which is in New York City. So that was what that piece was referring to. I mean, I didn't mention the name because it wasn't the name that was relevant, right? What's relevant is that it's a college in New York City. And New York has like the New York metro area has the largest Jewish population outside of Israel. So, I mean, and historically has had that. So it's like a large, perhaps the best established Jewish community in many ways. So like it was, I really love New York just like as a city. I still kind of like miss it. It's like the only time right now that I'm kind of happy that I'm not there right now for, unfortunate reasons because of the pandemic and how it spreads because it's so dense. But part of what I love about it is its density and its richness and culture and human beings and the energy that a lot of metro areas have and just its diversity. And but also going to college there was a really unique experience, and I picked I wanted to be so the 2 years in Canada was in an extremely remote place, and that was by design of the educational institution. And I grew up in Japan, which I've been told is a very sort of urbanized country in general. And so it was extremely difficult for me living in this remote area in Canada. The students, we were all from all over the world, so it wasn't the lack of diversity that was difficult. It was like the sheer fact that, you couldn't get out to like the small city of Victoria without walking an hour to the bus stop and then on the bus another hour, and they didn't run on Sundays because that's the kind of place it is, like, and just like sort of that remoteness was so difficult for me. So when I was applying to colleges, I knew that had to be New York City. And so that was one of the reasons why I ended up at a college in the middle of New York City. And then another thing that I didn't know about what that was going to do was that it was going to throw me really in the center of this super established, rich Jewish community, with very long historical roots too. So having grown up in Japan, like not in Tokyo, Jewish, so my mom's Jewish. She's an Ashkenazi Jewish woman from the New York, Connecticut area, and my dad's Japanese, and we grew up like celebrating Jewish stuff at home and keeping kosher, and like we kind of, and the Jewish Community Center, which is not like the gym JCC, but it's it's really the true Jewish community center where the Jewish community comes together. Like that's where the Hebrew schools happen. That's where the synagogue is. That's where the pool was also once upon a time when that had the Jewish library. And it was like really truly a Jewish community center. And when we went there, so the population there changed a lot over time because it was just where Jews landed. When they came to Japan, there were two synagogues, or two like Jewish communal spaces, which were centered around synagogues in Japan, and that's where they landed. So whatever Jewish person happened to be there, that's where they went. And and so it was like really multinational, right? We don't really have like native Japanese Jewish people, except for people, I mean, if there's a majority, it's like people like us out of intermarried couples, but I mean, calling that a majority is like, we're talking like, in single or maybe double digit units. So I feel like it's a little bit misleading. But that's really also like, it's really diverse in terms of the nationality and the types of people represented. Really the only thing that unites us is that we're Jewish, and perhaps because most of us have ended up, either we live in Japan in complete absolute minorities, whether you're from an intermarried family or you're, an expat from some whatever other country you came from, or whatever or you're married to a foreigner, like one of those people, whatever the situation is, anyone who sets foot into a JCC is a minority, that like by anyone's account, right, in that context. So we know what it means to live like the minority, and there was absolutely no question in that context that anyone would be Zionist, as in you would support a country where we could go and we would be safe, because also like there was anti-Semitism in Japan. Also, there was like in the 60s and 70s, like the Red Army and attacks to JCC, or like threats of attacks and stuff like that was also something that happened. So like that was kind of like a reality to us at all times, and the JCC was always very heavily guarded. The standard, like anywhere really outside of America and Canada, also a standard thing. As I found out when I traveled in France when I was between college and high school, and so it's just like I went to college in New York, and I saw like this flourishing, big, huge, established Jewish community where people were like, they could get ready-made kosher food like in the supermarkets, and I was shocked. It was like, I grew up reading every single ingredients on everything that we bought, because that was the only way you could ensure that it was like at least ingredient kosher, right? And even then, like we weren't talking about getting the factories checked out or anything. It was like just what you could see on there, it seemed kosher enough. Like that was sort of the level that you could do, but that was how we lived, and it didn't seem odd. Like that just seemed like that's what you do, and everything was what other people would consider very like difficult here, like keeping kosher, like not going. So like if you decide to like skip school for Rosh Hashanah or something, like you'd have to tell the teacher. Would you get complete acceptance. I mean, I lived in a very unusual city, so we did. But I know that if you lived anywhere else, people would be like, whatever the foreigners do, their weird things, you know, we won't bother them. But like, kind of, you know, that kind of sort of attitude. But the thing is, when I was in France for 2 summers, the French community was very similar to sort of, it was more established in the Japanese community for sure. Like, you know, they had communities of Jews in France. Most of them not French Jews anymore. You know, most of them Middle Eastern, like Tunisian Jews. But they were living there, and they also lived under like very similar sort of restrictions I was very used to, right? Like a lot of the families couldn't afford kosher beef, so they would just eat beef that was not kosher. And like, I mean, that's how I grew up too. I mean, we turned vegetarian when I was 13, but like occasionally when we would eat meat, it would be like just beef. It wasn't kosherly slaughtered beef, but you know, that's your restrictions that you live under. And I saw that in France, and it was very familiar to me. And I thought, oh yeah, this is how, you know, this is how it is. Like, how else would you be? But then in New York, when I was in college, people were like, oh, how could you live in a place like that? You know, like people would talk about the insurmountable difficulty of living in rural places. And so one of the places that we lived in was in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, because that was one of the places where I had a job, right? I was in academia. In academia, you go where your job is because you have absolutely no choice in the matter, right? And especially I was in a very small field. You have, if you're in a bigger field, then you get tiered. I was in a small enough field that the tier wasn't as relevant, but the flip side was that there were very few jobs. So I had to go wherever the job was. And so one of those places was rural Kentucky. And at the time, my partner was in yeshiva. And the yeshiva was based in New York. And his Rosh Yeshiva and everyone else kept saying, like, wow, how are you going to keep kosher there? Right? And we're just kind of like, first of all, we don't eat meat. So that's not an issue. But even if we did eat meat, you order it. You know, we're like, you buy it at the town over, and like you store it and you can, you know, defrost it. Like, definitely it was easier for us because we didn't eat meat. But, you know, even so, it's basically the only things that need hechshers are meat, cheese, and grape juice, or, you know, wine or any grape product, right? I mean, that's pretty much it. If you cook your own stuff from ingredients, you don't really need hechshers on anything else. The only other time is like Pesach, is a more difficult time. But, you know, we kept being asked this, and I was just, like, kind of getting irritated. And I was like, look, you guys, you think I don't know how to live in a place that's, like, sparsely Jewish populated? But you guys are in this place where, like, you know, in France, they carry around these little booklets that tell you which case number of which product, because they can't put hechshers on anything because of the anti-Semitism. So they put on these, you know, they tell you, like, which case numbers of which products are hechshered products. If you want to be that careful, that's what you have to carry around. And, you know, so that's how it is in France, which is a much more historic but established Jewish community than Japan. And having grown up in Japan, like, we didn't have that, but you read your ingredients, right? Like, that's how, like, sort of the majority of the Jewish world outside of Canada and America, where, like, you know, kashrut has become this big industrial complex where they stamp, you know, kosher signs on, like, water and stuff. You know, that's how people have lived, and I'm sure that's how people have lived historically too, right? This kashrut thing started in the early 20th century. People didn't have hechshers to rely on. They went to their kosher butchers, which is why even that rural Kentucky town that we lived in used to have a kosher butcher. Because if there were 3 kosher-keeping families, they were going to need a kosher butcher. That's gone, fine, but it's actually not so difficult to be observant. The difficulty is on the lack of community of the people doing it with you. But I kept getting these questions from Rosh Yeshiva and the people, and I was just like, you know, I just get irritated. I'm just like, look, it's just not so difficult. I grew up that way, and I know how to do it, and I also know the majority of the Jewish community outside of Israel, America, and Canada lives like that too. And even in America, people who live outside of these big established communities, that's how, you know, they do the best that they can with what they have, and that's how most Jewish communities have survived. So, I mean, that's where it's coming from. And now we live in Maine, and people in Maine are always like, oh, we have to go to Boston for this, we have to go to Boston for that. And I'm like, that's actually, you have to go to Boston for a few things, but you don't have to be there all the time. And you can totally live a Jewish life here. And especially in Maine, there's enough people. Like, you actually could make a community here. But, you know, people like to point to the reasons why they can't do something. And so it's that line comes from that frustration of sort of this textbook idea of what it means to be a properly observant Jew.
Wow, I love it. So, thinking about this idea of what is a textbook Jew in general, because you moved to New York, and when we think of New York, at least I think of diversity, right? Like I think of all different types of cultures and people and all of that. And yet, when you're talking about what is a Jewish sort of what is the attitude of Jewish community, it's sort of a hegemony, like almost an Ashken normative hegemony of like this is what it is, and it's making sure that the bottled water has the hechsher on it, and making sure that whatever. So I'm curious for you, sort of the intersection of being Asian, being Jewish, and landing in a place like New York, where I would think, because it's such a diverse place, you would have a bit of an easier go of it.
I did.
Yeah, did you?
Yeah, I loved living in New York. It was the first place in my life where I didn't stand out and I could be anonymous in a crowd. Um, and I didn't have to explain myself. Right, in the general context, like when you go into like certain crowds, like maybe, but I mean also the Jewish community is so diverse there, so like everyone has their own pick. Like I was affiliated with the liberal Orthodox communities. I was head of one of the groups. I was protected by the campus rabbi who and the administration there, I would say, which I, at the time, I just took it for granted. I didn't know that I was being protected from anything. Like, right. I just thought, well, I live in the world and I walk through the world like I'm a person. It's just that, much later I found out about like certain things that I was being protected from with stuff that people were saying. But, I wasn't sensitive to any of that stuff, partially because I wasn't acculturated American, so there were certain things that I did pick up on.
Right.
My English was fluent. It sounded more fluent than I was, if that makes sense. I came from speaking English only at home, and then 2 years of speaking English and, doing academic English in a completely international environment where half the students didn't speak English as a native language, so It was a communication device, right? And then I was landing in a place where, an elite American college, where people are not just fluent in English, they were, the elite. Like, they really spoke English at a much different, educated, elite English, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't pick up on everything, and I also wasn't sensitized to any of the prejudicial things that people would be saying because I didn't grow up with it. Like, I'm extremely sensitive around Japanese people, and I can't be around a lot of Japanese people because they're so quick to dismiss me as not really Japanese, to find some ways I'm not Japanese. And like, I didn't grow up with that with my Jewishness. Like, I showed up at the JCC, first of all, everyone knew us, but also they just saw me and they kind of assumed correctly that I was one of those kids who, was born and raised there. So, I never was questioned about my Jewish identity, and certainly no one denied it to me, because my Japanese friends either didn't know about Jews or I was the only Jew that they had met, right?
Sure.
And people at the JCC, like, they knew who I was, and there were so many different, it never came up. I've never heard anyone at the JCC saying, "Are you Jewish?" to anyone, ever.
Do you think that this has anything to do with this idea of a smaller community versus a larger one? And obviously with New York, it's a little different because you're dealing with large and diverse, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You mean in terms of my experience of the Tokyo JCC?
Yeah, because people knew you, right? And so you had a more familial relationship than, say, even someone who, let's say, converts to Judaism and then they're made to feel like they're not Jewish enough, or a person who's part of an interfaith or intercultural background somewhere outside of New York, where they're going to be a minority within a minority within a minority. That there's something about the size of a community that can either be very comforting because everybody knows each other and there's something to that, or a community can be small and therefore put off by anyone who they deem as other or different.
Right. So it depends, I think, on the nature of the small community.
Mm-hmm.
So the Tokyo JCC by nature is an extremely transient community and small. So part of the reason why I was in question was not just because people knew me, because not everyone there knew me or my parents. The old timers did, but there were very few old timers, right? Like I even remember like 20 years ago when I was sitting at the table with like the old timers that knew me as a child. There were
Sure.
5 of them.
Wow.
There
Yeah.
were 5 of them out of like, right, and they all happened to be there at the same time, which is also pretty unusual. And I think I know one of them actually was originally American. I happened to meet a relative of his in California like 3 years ago, just kind of, yeah. And then like one of them, I don't know if he's still alive. The other one I know has been kind of a little bit disenfranchised from the community. I mean, and my mom like only goes in like a couple of times a year, but that's always been true. So, even that, those are the sort of, and everyone else like comes and goes. Like they either stay for, the longest someone stays is like maybe 20, 30 years. And usually the families don't stay there. So like there's no like generational sort of continuity there so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the reasons why people don't get questioned, because it's so transient. And also, I mean, there are just so many different kinds of people. But, it's also probably become smaller. And the Tokyo JCC that I know is from 20 years ago, and that's quite a while back.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what it's like now, right? I knew it. I mean, I grew up in it, and then I haven't been back for like not quite 20 years, but maybe 10, 15 years, I think was the last time. I haven't been there since it's been rebuilt. And also the Jewish landscape in Japan has also changed quite a bit, because now a Chabad has found its place, a Chabad house has found its place there. And so that has split the more observant and the liberal communities.
Gotcha.
So it's a very different landscape now.
Got it. So I wanted to sort of bring the conversation into some of the things that, as of the recording of this interview, have been going on. We're seeing the growth, in some ways, the rebirth, the realignment, however you want to word it, of Black Lives Matter. A lot more consciousness around this country's history with race, and to sort of bring that into a conversation about Jews of color. Read a comment that someone had posted on a social media site, unrelated to anyone in this room, who is an Asian Jew, and had said, I don't know if I belong in the conversation of being a Jew of color. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I frequently bump into that issue, where I find that the line of color changes in a context in every sort of way, like geographic context, literary context, racial context, and I think that's always something that Asians in this country constantly face. And I mean, I sometimes feel that way too. Like sometimes I find that of color is used as a euphemism to mean black. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I find it to be used as a euphemism for African American and Latina or Latinx, right? In which case it's like very specifically hyphenated American. And sometimes I see it used like to mean, anyone who's not white, and sometimes I hear it being used to mean like underrepresented minorities, which actually excludes. Well, that also depends on context, but I know it mostly from the academic context, in which case Asians are usually excluded out of that, unless you're talking about specific fields, and includes native native people. So I think it's like very convoluted and tricky. I also do think that the way Jews eventually became white, like Ashkenazi Jews, and like whether Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews, that's like such a, I feel like they're also like this weird twilight zone along with um, Asians. But you know, Ashkenazi Jews are certainly can be considered white at this point in large urban places. Um, and I think that Asians are the next, right? East Asians, I think, are the next to become that, like the first honorary white and then eventually white people. And of course, I said this to a friend of mine who's Korean American, who's like, can't happen. But I was just like, yeah, I think that's how the Jews 10 and 50 years ago too. I'm pretty sure it's going to happen. I mean, it's already kind of happened, I feel like, you know. I mean, in a lot of places, like a lot of people sort of see Asians as the model minority, and sometimes as the East Asians, they like even neglect to see the feature differences and stuff. I mean, race is very obviously a social construct, and it shows up in the way it's uneven, in the way it gets enforced or it gets reinforced, I think.
Um,
Ashkenazi Jews
no, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Ashkenazi Jews are not white in certain parts of the country.
Wow.
And, you know, there's got to be acknowledgement of that. And it's really frustrating to me that even the Jew of color community and the very liberal, like, you know, wanting to be good allies, white Jewish community is just flat, you know, they flat out don't want to deal with that. And they keep saying, gotta understand, you know, anti-Semitism is not mutually exclusive of white privilege. And I'm like, yes, that's true. But you also have to understand that in many places in this country that are not the urban metropoles that get to dictate the terms of how these things gets talked about, there are a lot of places where Ashkenazi Jews are not white. Like I saw it, smelt it, and felt it, right? Like, and the people who grew up in those places, you know, first of all, it's sort of carved into the way they behave and the way they talk, and they've also, you know, said that. And I know what they mean, having lived in Kentucky, I know what they're talking about. You know, a place where people talk about like a Jewish family that lived there 20 years ago. Wasn't there a Jewish family that lived there 20 years ago when you say that I'm Jewish? Like,
right.
You know, they're not very assimilated. I mean, I'm sure they weren't, you know, super observant or anything either. It's just, and there was like a, you know, spouse of a faculty member who was married to a non-Jewish spouse, and for as far as we could tell, did nothing Jewish, but everyone knew her as the Jewish person. She had been living there 40 years or something. I mean, how can you say that she's considered white if people are marking you as Jewish like at every turn, regardless of what you do or don't do, right? And I mean, that's just not, that you're just not white in a place like that. And so, so going back to your original question about what, you know, Asians and the Jew of color conversation, I think there are a lot of gray zones, and it's very difficult to define. And I mean, you just have to live with those contradictions and ambiguities and just sort of make peace with it and decide where you want to sit.
It would seem like a very difficult, I mean, all of these are difficult issues, but in a sense, the Jewish community sort of became the model minority in certain ways. And from what you're telling us about the Asian community, another kind of model minority set of issues, different group, but same issues. So what happens when you have this model minority, you know, maybe stereotypes around elitism financially or educationally or whatever, and then you put of color into it? It would seem like that would be really difficult to try to navigate.
Does it make it difficult or does it make it easier. I don't know. Because in some ways they meld together. Um, in terms of being able to never escape the stereotype, I guess it's harder. I'm just trying to sort of think about, yeah, I mean, I don't think I say anything that's helpful for people who are younger and who come from a similar demographic as me and who are looking for like sort of solutions and ways to cope with things better, because sort of the only thing I can say is I've sort of, you know, suffered through things, gone through things, and found the people who I can relate to, hung on to them. We built things together sometimes, and just kind of then have to come to a place where you have enough of a fortress for yourself that you don't have to worry too much anymore. And maybe those are some of the things are like habits that you implement in life. Some of them are things that you've built, but there's that. And, I like one of the things in college that was really hard for me was that, so, I was a leader in the Jewish community, and I knew I was like hanging out with Jews all the time, like, and which is not very difficult on that campus. 30% of the students and staff and, 30% of the population on campus was Jewish, like self-identified Jewish.
Wow.
Like that's a huge number. So, sorry. So that, I was hanging around, so just like hanging around exclusively. I mean, it wasn't entirely exclusively around Jews, but it was like really most of the time I was just around Jews. And one of the things was that some of them could be not so nice. And I think this was like also the school I was going to, right? It was not necessarily the Jewish population, but just like the school that I went to was like, it was an elitist school. Like people were not known for their kindness. Like that's not what they're known for. They're known for how smart they are or whatever, or how, well they jump through hoops. So I so there was a lot of snobism towards people who didn't get like cultural references, who weren't witty and things like that. And because like I was not a acculturated American, and because my English was really not so great compared to people who normally go to places like that, I encountered like a lot of snobism. Like people are like, oh, who's a stupid girl, basically.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to hear that.
So, what?
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, I mean, it was just kind of, but so the way I kind of got through that was I didn't really care. Like that wasn't something I experienced most of my life. In fact, it was kind of opposite of what I experienced most of my life. It didn't hurt me because I had no baggage around it. But for me, it acted as a filter to find the people who are kind. And so my friends from college, for most part, have been extremely kind and loyal people. Who I've been able to, right, like cultivate good relationships with. And, just the people who are, I mean, it was like an easy way to filter out the like really nice people. And I kind of, like that was kind of important for me growing up in Japan also, because I had the opposite problem of people wanting to be like friends because I was, exotic, and they assumed a lot of things about people who are racially mixed. So I was, I was always like interested in finding filters of how to find the good people who you wanted to be associated with. So like the way the filters work were different in Japan and here, but like I still have very clear filters in both cases. And so, you find those people and you make sure you share with them and you build your cohort.
That's really beautiful.
And, yeah, I mean so of the color, I mean. The of color thing, the way it works, I think, in English and in the U.S., I think, is that, really the race relations here are defined against Black people, right? Like, whiteness is defined against Blackness, I think, at a very fundamental level. I would say that the Native people are obliterated from the narrative and history. and race is defined in this, bifurcated white versus black. And so I think, and this is one of the reasons why I think the Black Lives Matter movement is so powerful, because if you can dismantle anti-black racism, which I think is at the core of both race relations and racism in this country, like if you can get at that, you've really made tremendous progress around the whole notion. I mean, it's like, it's not a paradigm shift, it's completely disrupting the entire narrative. It's just disrupting the whole notion of what race is in this country, And so, I mean, that's why, like, I'm riveted by the whole thing. I'm so impressed and really moved that I'm able to witness this to be living in this historical moment that this is happening. And so, the of color thing, it's there, but, it's just, the whole conversation is just like completely, it's in such, it's like in convulsion, right? Like this whole idea of race is in such convulsion, which means that like of color is also this whole notion that's convulsing, right? Convulsing, like shaking in convulsion right now, like not coming up with the proper way to say it. But, so it's tricky, but I think that anyone who's not black is going to be in this in-between zone. Like that's kind of how race is in this country. And at different historical moments and different geographical locations, there's some of us in certain racial categories that align with that blackness, and sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. Like the miscegenation laws sometimes applied to Asians and sometimes didn't, right? It was state by state. And so like in that sense, if you think about it, sometimes they were like in line with anti-black, like interracial, black-white interracial relations, and sometimes it wasn't. I mean, the only thing they have in common was that it was white-centered. So, I mean, if you think about it like that, it's just, yeah, I mean, I guess what it comes down to is that I'm used to not being counted in these conversations, and I'm used to always being stuck in between. So I'm not surprised. I think I almost don't know what to do when people suddenly are like, well, let me hear about your story. Like, how is your, category, how does your category have a whole group of people? And how can you represent that whole group of people? I'm like, I don't. Yeah. We're absolute minorities.
Well, that was a wonderful thing about us, speaking with each other, and talking about you being willing to take this time with us, as you saying, I don't know what I have to offer. Here's what I have to offer. And you've offered yourself and you've offered your story. And that's very meaningful. So we have with us rabbinical student Amanda Flax. Amanda, do you have any questions for our speaker?
Well, thank you for sharing your experience. I hate to admit that I didn't know that there was much of a Jewish community in Japan. So I learned something today, even though you say it's very small. But I would love to, hear if you've had any experiences here in the U.S. I gave a presentation for Shavuot about making inclusive Jewish spaces, specifically centered around the convert community, like welcoming converts. But at the end of my presentation, I spoke that the things I was talking about would also include Jews of color, or Jews who identify as something other than the Ashkenazi normative Judaism. And if you were to give, I don't know, one or two things that maybe would help welcome people that might look different or grew up differently overseas in the United States, like the typical American synagogue, is there anything that you would recommend we change or offer?
I don't know. I mean,
yeah, and it's okay if you don't have an answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that, like, so, yeah, the conflation of being a non-Ashkenazi Jew and a convert, I think, is really problematic. And that was, like, one of the big things that I constantly had to keep, like, so this was not in college so much. In college was, like, just sort of a whole other bubble of itself. But um, once I was out of college, like, I kept encountering people, like, asking me my journey to Judaism, or, like, how did I
Mm-hmm.
become, and, like, it was so euphemistic, and I was never asked, like, how I became Jewish to my face before. Like, no one assumed I was, I had converted, so, like, I didn't understand the question,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't know what they were talking about. So, like, I ended up, like, just kind of telling them my parents' story, right? And, like, that often satisfied people because they were looking for that, exotic hook, right?
Right.
And it was also one of the things that kind of made me realize that, like, I was being sort of excluded from normative Jewishness out of that. And it was, like, kind of like, after I kind of started catching on to it, I was like, kind of like, that's kind of yucky. Like, they were like, and they were, like, using me as, like, a monkey, like I was this exotic little animal that they were going to study and be like, oh, now, like, now I've gotten that little curiosity thing out of the way. And they were, like, literally, like, some people would just be like, that was really, oh, this actually happened in college a lot, where people would be like, oh, that was very interesting, thank you very much, and, like, they'll walk away, and, like, that was kind of it. um and I mean, I think, and also, like, I sometimes got, like, I would be, like, introduced to have a roommate who was, like, converting or something. Like, I would be, like, a good guide or something, and I'll be like, I know nothing about the conversion process because it's such a
Right.
secretive thing, and I didn't convert myself. So how am I supposed to know what they're going through? This is, like, a really bad idea. So, like, that kind of, like, sort of assumption based on appearance, um, is, I think, problematic. I mean, just I think the synagogues have to be a lot more careful about awareness raising in terms of, there are Jews who look all kinds of ways for all kinds of reasons. And it's not just because, some people are adopted and some people are actually born to parents like this. And just general awareness of that, and not, um, yeah, like, having that kind of awareness. Like, one of the things that I keep checking my partner about is, like, he talks, because Black Lives Matter is such a, like, big part of the rhetoric right now. He likes to talk about it. I'm like, the way you talk about it, you make it sound as though, like, Black people can't be Jews. Like, you need to be more inclusive in your language, right? It's like, I don't know how to do that. I'm like, so you say, like, Blacks, Jewish, and non, like, Jewish and non-Jewish Black people. Like, say it, like, it's not such a difficult, like, thing to say, but just, like, it's those little things that people say that make people who are not aware of those realities kind of stop and say, wait, the rabbi just said,
Mm-hmm.
Black, Jewish, or not, right?
Yeah.
Isn't he implying then that they're Jewish Black people or Black Jewish people? Like, and there's just kind of stuff like that, and letting that kind of sort of, using inclusive language.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
To sort of bring something local to that. So Amanda and I are both sort of from the Atlanta area, and there's
Mm-hmm.
actually an organization called the Black Jewish Coalition. And I always
Okay.
wondered, like, what was that like for Black Jews? Right? So are they
Mm-hmm.
the quintessential part of the Black Jewish Coalition because they are Black Jews, or are they, is there an assumption just even with the name Black Jewish Coalition, right? A coalition means separate groups that come together,
Mm-hmm.
and that name in and of itself has that, um, you know, has that difficult assumption, the conflation of Jewishness and whiteness, right? Or at least Jewishness and non-blackness.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a tough one. Last question that I have for you, just because you have the experience of both sort of the non-Orthodox and the Orthodox community or observant community, whatever language we'd like to use, do you see there being any difference in terms of how the observant community maybe is thinking about some of these issues, or maybe is receptive to or not receptive to Jews of multiple ethnic, cultural, national backgrounds? And I'm sure I've just, opened a gigantic can of worms right here in the last few minutes. So we'll leave it at we'll leave it at whatever you have to say about that.
In terms of prejudice towards people of different ethnicities and races, I find them to be completely the same, which was, the way they express themselves, the way they present are different, but what's at the core is the same. I don't find any difference there, which is why when some Jews of color complain about the difficulties they have, and like some liberal Jews are like, so why don't you come to our side? I'm just kind of like, it's the same. It's the same wherever you go, as long as you're associating with like the normative Jewish communities. It's going to be the same. It's just going to look different.
How does it look different?
What?
How does it look different?
Do you really want to get into this?
Do you want to give me the Cliff Notes version?
What?
Do you want to give me the Cliff's Notes version, maybe? Should have asked this in the beginning.
So, these are like broad generalizations,
Sure,
right?
sure.
Because it's a Cliff Notes version. But I'll say like one of the most representative cases or ways that they present themselves is that you encounter something, and if you read Mara Gad's recent excerpt from her book that was turned into an article, you'll really see this. You encounter this thing where like the liberal side is like, we are very inclusive, we're inclusive of everyone, and they say this, and when you encounter, because when something happens to you, you tell them, and immediately they deny that it happened to you at all. And so there's like this double injury going on, of like, having had someone say something to you, like, so whatever the classic thing is, like assuming that maybe you're one of the servers, or like, you're one of the organizers. And I think all that stuff depends on what your race is. Like, I'm probably more, likely to be mistaken as like the organizer, right? Like someone who's Black is probably more likely to be mistaken as a server, like that kind of stuff, right? Like but we get mistaken as not belonging to the group that's there. And then you tell that to someone and they're like, oh, that can't be, that's so wrong. Okay, but someone did it and does it all the time. Like, so there's that. So like, that's very difficult to kind of have to like pander to that, fragility of like not being liberal enough. And then on the Orthodox side, I think it tends to, or like the more, in that part, I think you tend to have things where like people kind of assume things about like lack of knowledge or lack of something sort of, and they will like help you with things and they're trying to be helpful. It tends to be like, sort of condescending. Like they kind of assume that you're forever like, right, they're kind of nice about it, but then forever they kind of assume that you're going to be an outsider and never quite enough. But the rhetoric is still that, also they also always assume that you've converted, which that goes both sides. But and then like, so they will forever not allow you to, maybe marry one of their kids. Like this is like I never was part of like that kind of a community, but there's some of that too. And also always assuming a lack, but the rhetoric is still that if you're Jewish, and you're not allowed to, remind a convert of their status as a convert, because that's it, So they would everyone has this thing with like, they have the talk and the universalistic like values of not embarrassing or, disparaging and all that stuff, but like the way it comes out, like they're still doing it. And then, you tell people it happened and it's like, that couldn't happen. It's wrong.
Right.
It's wrong, but it happened. So what are you going to do about it?
Right.
So that I would say that's the difference.
Got it. Got it. Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Abbie, for your time today. Really appreciate you being here. We're definitely going to have in the class links to all of the various things you've been involved with, your article on Tribe Herald, and we just can't thank you enough. Appreciate you being here with us.
Sure.